My dear friend, tonight, as you lie quietly under the blanket, your steady breathing blending with the rhythm of time, we shall together open another door to the past. A door that closed nearly 500 years ago, but still left a crack, through which whispers seeped out, falling into the night where you and I are now sitting, listening. Beyond that door is the Tower of London. The cold stone walls, each brick steeped in mist and blood, have witnessed countless fates that ended in silence. And among them, there was a woman whose final footsteps still echo Anne Boleyn. Perhaps you have heard this name before, the woman who made a king change the church, who stepped from the shadows of the court onto the throne of England. But tonight's story is not a song of triumph. It is a sorrowful melody, woven from the last 17 days of her life, days in which every hour, every minute, was an invisible torment, when silence was more frightening than the sword, and darkness did not lie outside, but within the heart. Try closing your eyes. You imagine a May morning in the year 1536. Fog thick over the surface of the Thames. In the narrow room of the Tower of London, Anne sits by the small window, her eyes dry and unblinking. She once wore the crown of a queen, once was hailed, once made all of Europe tremble before her pride. And now, here, in this very place, she can only hear the fading footsteps along the corridor and the scratching quill of the jailer, steady as the ticking of a clock counting down. Tonight, we shall walk with Anne through those 17 days. We will hear the whispers arranged to break her spirit. We will feel the heartbeat of a queen turned into a criminal. And then, when the last mist dissolves on the morning of the 19th of May, we will see the glint of a cold blade end a life, yet open a legend. Do not be afraid. This is not a tale meant to startle, but to listen to, like the wind gently passing the stone walls, like the steady breath in the night. For the most terrifying thing is not the fall of the sword, but the silence itself, the silence that followed Anne through her final 17 days. And that follows us now in each slow rhythm of tonight's telling. So then, let the light in your room dim a little. Take a deep breath, and step with me into the story. And then, on the 2nd day of May, in the year 1536, the trap closed. Anne was summoned before the Privy Council. Familiar faces, once allies, once raised their cups in celebration when she wore the crown, now coldly read out the accusations: adultery with 5 men, incest with her own brother, and a plot to murder King Henry. Anne fell silent for a moment, then burst out laughing. A dry, hollow laugh, not because she found it amusing, but because its absurdity was too vast, too naked. Yet the laugh quickly faded, replaced by a heavy silence. She was arrested that very day, without a chance to say farewell to her little daughter, without a chance to return to her own chamber, to gather a thing. And the boat that carried her along the Thames back toward the Tower of London traced the very same path she had taken 3 years earlier, in glory to be crowned queen. But now, the cheers had vanished. Only the cold wind and the downcast eyes of the people on either bank remained. The Tower of London received her with a deadly silence. The heavy gate closed behind, and Anne stepped into the chamber once used to prepare her coronation. Everything was still there: the hanging tapestries, the window frames, the carved bed, but all had turned into mocking phantoms. A familiar space, now transformed into a gilded prison. She was not alone. Beside Anne were her ladies-in-waiting, but none came to comfort. They were carefully chosen to observe, to record, to whisper into other ears each time Anne sighed or wept. Even her own aunt, Lady Shelton, was placed to watch her, not as kin, but as the eyes and ears of the Crown. Each night, Sir William Kingston, the jailer, sent detailed reports to Cromwell. Today she laughed too loudly. Today she whispered while praying. Today she wept until she collapsed. Anne knew she was being watched. And the more she knew, the harder it was to breathe. Imagine every word you speak, every glance, even your sleep, becomes a weapon against you. The brick walls stood still, but it seemed as though hundreds of ears pressed close. Hundreds of eyes fixed upon her, day after day. Anne was trapped in an endless game of the mind. They fed her fragments of news that Mark Smeaton had confessed, that Henry Norris had nodded his head, that George Boleyn was condemned for incest. No one showed her proof. No one let her see the confessions. Yet even so, it was enough to unsettle her. Could a smile, a gift, a glance from years past now be twisted into guilt? What was frightening was not the accusations, but the murky void. Anne began to doubt her own memories. She asked herself again and again, could I have been careless? Could a single jest have turned into evidence? Could my brother have? And so, suspicion itself gnawed at her hour by hour. Yet still, at times, Anne struggled to hold on to some shred of dignity. She prayed. She read the scriptures. She asked for news of her daughter Elizabeth. She wrote letters to Henry, to Cromwell. But those letters never reached their hands. They were withheld, as part of a cruel game. Some days, Anne was strangely calm, speaking with her ladies about politics, about the court, as though she were still queen. But just a moment later, she might burst into violent sobs, or laugh uncontrollably. Kingston recorded these moods and called her mad. But in truth, it was not madness. It was a human response to fear and to silence stretched to its breaking point. And so, with each day of those 17, Anne did not die from chains or from the sword. She died slowly in the torment of all that she did not know. Day 1. The 2nd of May in the year 1536. The heavy door of the Tower of London closed behind Anne. That sound echoed like an invisible sentence. She stepped into the spacious chamber, with its splendid embroidered tapestries, the intricately carved bed. Everything looked just as it had 3 years earlier, when she was here to prepare for her coronation. But now, each object seemed to turn into a mocking shadow. Anne sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clutching tightly at her gown. She tried to whisper to herself, "This is only a misunderstanding. Henry will summon me. He once promised he would die to protect me." In that moment, Anne still held hope. The hope that all of this was nothing more than a fleeting political game. But as dusk fell, reality slowly revealed itself. The ladies in waiting at her side were no longer confidantes, but watchful eyes. She asked about Elizabeth, her little daughter, not yet 3 years old, but the only reply was silence. As night descended, Anne could not sleep. The scratching quill of William Kingston, the jailer, echoed outside the door, recording each movement, each smile, each tear of hers. That first night ended without chains, without torture. Yet Anne had already begun to understand. It was silence itself that was the most merciless chain. Day 2, the 3rd of May, in the year 1536, on the second morning. The first news was leaked. One of the servants whispered Mark Smeaton, the young musician, had confessed to having relations with the Queen. Anne froze, then laughed. A hoarse, trembling laugh. How could that be? A lowly man, who was never allowed near me in such a way. But the laugh quickly turned into fear. If Smeaton had confessed, even under coercion, then the whole world would believe her guilty. All that day, Anne tried to remain calm. She prayed, read the scriptures, and spoke with her ladies, striving to prove she was still in possession of reason. But by nightfall, the silence gripped her once again. She broke down in tears, sobbing until she was exhausted. Kingston recorded once more. The Queen laughed and then cried, her spirits unsettled. In the flickering candlelight, Anne realized that her enemies did not yet need blood. They only needed to plant a few seeds of doubt, and she herself would be tormented by those very seeds. Day 3, the 4th of May in the year 1536. That morning, Anne heard the news that Sir Henry Norris, Henry's dearest friend, had also been arrested. The news stunned her. Norris was loyal, a close companion of the king, trusted above all others. If a man such as he could be dragged down, then who could be safe? Anne paced the chamber, whispering to her ladies that this was only a plot, that surely Norris was innocent. Yet deep within, a wave of dread was rising. If Norris too should confess, even under pressure, then what value would her own words hold? That evening, Anne forced herself to speak as though everything remained normal. She spoke of politics, of court, of Henry, as if to affirm that she was still queen. But those very words were noted by the ladies, twisted into evidence, for Cromwell to distort. Each act of self-defense became another rope tightening around her. When night fell, Anne sat by the small window, gazing out at the black waters of the Thames. The river flowed silently, as though it had never known the cries within the tower. She whispered Henry, "Do you still remember me?" But only the darkness replied. Day 4, the 5th of May in the year 1536. The 4th day came, and Anne began to feel that time within the Tower of London was not like that of the outside world. Each hour seemed longer, each night heavier, and every footstep echoing through the corridor startled her. In the morning, as the pale light filtered through the narrow window, Anne heard that Francis Weston had also been arrested. A young man, just past 20, once known for his light-heartedness and rash spirit. To Anne, Weston had only ever been part of passing conversations at court, a laugh at a banquet table. But now, his name was bound to hers in charges of adultery. Anne sat frozen, not laughing as she had when hearing of Smeaton, not reasoning as she had when hearing of Norris. She only shook her head, her eyes vacant. For the more people drawn into this, the clearer it became that this was no longer about truth or falsehood, but about a game of chess. In that game, every person, friend, ally, even kin, became a pawn pushed forward to be sacrificed. All through the midday, Anne sat still, her hands resting on her lap, voicing not a word. The ladies in waiting still watched, waiting for her to speak a single line to remember. But today, Anne held her silence. That silence was like a fragile shield, the only one she could raise against the prying eyes. When night descended, Anne rose from the bed and stepped to the window. Outside, the London sky was shrouded in clouds, without moon or stars. She stared into that darkness and thought of Henry. Could he hear her prayers, or was he now listening only to the laughter within the arms of another woman? The 4th day ended, not with violent sobbing, nor with words of defense. It ended in the silence of someone beginning to understand she was being erased, piece by piece. Day 5, the 6th of May in the year 1536. The 5th day opened with a blow straight to Anne's heart. George Boleyn, her own brother, had been arrested. The news did not come through any official announcement, but through whispers deliberately dropped into her chamber. Anne sat upright, her eyes wide, her hands gripping the edge of the bed. George was not only her brother, he was her closest support in court. the one who walked with her through dangerous years, shared secrets, defended her against slander. And now, George's name was entangled in a charge so vile that she dared not speak it aloud. Incest, she whispered. It cannot be. It cannot be. The trembling words fell as though she feared the cold walls themselves would carry them back to Cromwell. Through the noon hours, Anne paced the room, clutching her head, her breath unsteady. She remembered every conversation with George, every playful jest, every glance of sympathy. Those pure memories suddenly turned into knives that others could twist to stab her. The more she thought, the more panic consumed her, as though her own memory had become a traitor. The ladies watched everything. They whispered that Anne laughed and cried, that she changed her mood in an instant. Those notes were sent by Kingston as proof of her madness. But Anne was not mad. She was drowning in grief, too great to bear if even her brother could be turned into a weapon. Then what limit could there be to such persecution? When night fell, Anne knelt with her hands upon the scriptures. Tears rolled down, blotting the pages. She pleaded, "Lord, please keep my brother from the crime they force upon him. Please let us meet again, even once, before it all ends." The fifth day closed in heavy darkness, where a woman began to understand that her enemies did not merely seek to strip her of her crown, they sought to blacken her name until nothing remained but ashes. Day 6, the 7th of May in the year 1536. On the 6th morning, Anne awoke with swollen eyes after a long night of weeping and prayer. The light through the narrow window fell across her face with a pallor that seemed half living, half drained. It was the day Anne voiced the only plea that still bound her to the world, to see Elizabeth. Her little daughter, only 3 years old, was the one fragment that reminded her she was a mother, a human being, and not only a criminal. Anne spoke to the ladies, her voice trembling. "Please let me see the child, just once, only once." But the faces around her did not change. Cold eyes, forced smiles, refusals spoken like dull blades, cutting slowly into her heart. Not permitted. Through the midday hours, Anne sat by the window, her eyes turned toward the Thames. She imagined seeing Elizabeth, pale hair, small frame running in the garden, calling mother. But it existed only in memory. The reality was a wall of stone, heavy footsteps in the corridor, and watchful eyes on her every breath. As evening fell, Anne knelt beside the bed. She whispered her prayers, tears falling on her clasped hands. She did not pray for herself. She prayed for her daughter, that Elizabeth would grow, would be safe, that even if she were gone, the child would live. When night came, Kingston recorded again. The Queen wept much, spoke constantly of her daughter, her spirits broken. To Cromwell, it was a detail in his plan, but to Anne, it was a crack that could never be mended. The 6th day ended, leaving a mother in despair. She had come to understand that her enemies had not only trapped her within stone walls, but had severed her from motherhood, the last thread tying her to life. Day 7, the 8th of May, in the year 1536. On the 7th day in the Tower, Anne no longer waited for news. 6 days had taught her that each whisper that reached her ears carried a fresh wound, and the wound of that day was truly fatal. One of the ladies, while pouring water, let slip, as if by chance, Jane Seymour had been taken into her own chambers, close to the king, and upon her chest she wore a locket with Henry's portrait. Anne sat motionless. A locket, a small object. Yet to her, it bore a meaning greater than any evidence. It was a public acknowledgement that Jane was no longer the hidden woman, but the Queen-to-be, who would replace her openly. She gave a faint laugh. brittle as a cracked mirror. "So then, I am already dead," she whispered, to her voice so low it was hard to tell if it was words or breath. That entire day, Anne spoke little. She did not beg, did not explain, did not weep as in days before. She sat quietly, her fingers tapping the table, her eyes distant. The ladies observed her, noting nothing more than, "She is strangely silent." But within Anne's heart, storms roared. When night fell, she stepped to the mirror and removed her necklace. A small gesture, but in her mind, it was a farewell to the title of Queen. For if Henry had chosen to place his portrait upon another woman's breast, then this marriage, this love, and even that crown were finished. The seventh day closed in the painful silence of a woman who knew she had been utterly replaced. Day 8, the 9th of May, in the year 1536. On the 8th day, Anne faced more than walls and whispered rumours. The chamber door opened, and a group of officials entered. No whips, no chains, only questions. So gentle, they seemed harmless. "Has your Majesty ever been alone with Sir Henry Norris? Has your Majesty ever given gifts to Mark Smeaton? Has your Majesty ever laughed too warmly with Francis Weston?" Anne listened to each, replying with honesty once she had been with Norris. But in a garden full of others, once she had given Smeaton a token, but only an innocent keepsake. Once she had laughed with Weston, but only as a hostess at table. Yet she knew every explanation could be twisted. Each innocent truth in Cromwell's hands would become stones laid to build her guilt. When the officials left, Anne remained, her heart tangled. She realized the trap did not lie in the questions, but in the absence of context. Any memory could be torn from its place and set into another scene, another meaning. And then, even her own recollections became traitors. That afternoon, Anne spoke little. She sat before the scriptures, turning each page, her trembling fingers tracing the words, as though clinging to the one truth that could not be distorted, the word of God. When night came, she could scarcely sleep. In the dark chamber, Anne paced, whispering, "If truth itself can be turned into falsehood, then what remains for me to defend?" Thus the 8th day closed, not in fear of death, but in a deeper fear that her very truth would be made into a weapon. Day 9, the 10th of May in the year 1536. On the 9th day, the air within the tower grew heavier. Anne sat by the window, her eyes dry, waiting for a ray of light. But what reached her was only another cruel blow. The ladies, their voices soft yet sharp as blades, whispered, "They have all confessed. Every one of them has admitted guilt." Anne froze. "They confessed," she repeated, as though needing her own ears to confirm such absurdity. Mark Smeaton. Perhaps he had been tortured until he nodded. Henry Norris. The king's most loyal companion. How could he betray George, her brother? Could he ever utter a confession of incest? A crime so vile, it chilled even to speak of. Anne did not believe, yet she could not deny. For Cromwell had never needed truth. He needed only ink on paper with trembling signatures. And now, those signatures were strangling her. Through the noon hours, she sat rigid, her hands clutching her gown, until her knuckles whitened. In her mind, memories spun banquets, handshakes, careless jests, all suddenly transformed into evidence against her. She began to doubt herself. Had I been too friendly? Had I laughed too freely? Had I, without knowing, planted the seeds of my own destruction? As evening fell, Anne broke into sobs. no longer the faint weeping of past nights. These were anguished cries, wrung from her chest as if to expel all torment at once. The ladies watched, then noted it down. Kingston would report. The Queen wept violently upon hearing that the men confessed. That night, Anne sat on the bed, a candle lit, her eyes bloodshot. She whispered to herself, "If all speak lies, then who will speak truth to me? If all nod their heads, then what meaning does my voice still hold?" The 9th day ended in despair, as Anne began to understand that truth no longer had a place in this game. Day 10. The 11th of May in the year 1536. The 10th day began with a small piece of news. Yet to Anne it weighed heavier than any sentence. Henry no longer spoke her name. Not with anger, not with curses. Simply silence. He spoke of affairs of state, of hunting, of Jane Seymour. But within his words, Anne had vanished. When she heard, Anne sat still for a long while. Her eyes followed the wavering candle flame, her lips murmuring, "So I have already died," within his heart. It was not a sigh, but a statement, stark and chilling. That noon, Anne took up pen and paper. She wrote a letter to Henry. With all the pain and remnants of hope she still possessed, she pleaded for an audience, to explain, to look once more into his eyes and affirm that their love had not yet been erased completely. The words trembled yet retained dignity, not those of a criminal, but of a wife, a queen. But that letter never left the Tower of London. It was withheld, folded, tucked into the report sent directly to Cromwell. Henry would never read it, and Anne would never know. As evening came, Anne sat by the window, her hand upon her chest, where once so many tokens of love had hung. Now that space was cold as ash. She did not cry, did not laugh, but sat as still as stone, for the deepest pain was not to be hated, but to be forgotten. The 10th night closed in silence. No footsteps echoed loudly in the corridor. No voices of inquiry pressed her. Only Anne remained, alone, facing the truth. Henry had erased her name from his life, as though she had never existed. Day 11, the 12th of May in the year 1536. On the 11th day, the air inside the tower was colder than usual. The wind slipped through the narrow window, carrying with it the damp, earthy scent of the Thames. Anne sat there, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the silver ripples in the distance. That morning, she heard a whisper that perhaps the king might show mercy, that if Anne would admit fault or sign some confession, Henry might spare her life, sending her into a convent to live hidden away. Anne's heart stirred. She thought of Elizabeth, of the chance to live on, even if only within the stone walls of a convent. Hope, small but burning, flickered in her chest. But by afternoon, another message fell, like a merciless stone. Henry wished to hear no more of her. No convent, no pardon, only silence, and preparations for another wife. Anne clutched her head, whispering, "They give me a little light, only to snuff it out." That evening, she drifted through her chamber like a shadow, praying, wavering. At times she clung to the thought that Henry still remembered her. At other times she surrendered, believing death was already at the door. The ladies recorded it all, whispering to one another. The Queen shifts between hope and despair, her moods unstable. But for Anne, it was not instability. It was the natural sway of one living inside a storm, where every rumour, every glance, every half-spoken word could either break her heart or ignite it for a fleeting instant. The 11th night closed with a prayer without clear direction. Anne did not pray for herself, nor exactly for Henry. She prayed for truth, that one day Elizabeth would know her mother had not gone down in silence. Day 12, the 13th of May in the year 1536. On the 12th day, Anne began to see more clearly the trap Cromwell had spun around her. She was not scourged with whips, nor bound in chains. She was imprisoned in a dungeon of words. That morning, when a lady repeated something Anne had spoken days before, words about Elizabeth, about Henry, about her innocence, Anne realized every phrase she uttered, even a weary whisper, was picked up, wrapped carefully, and delivered elsewhere as evidence. She froze, silent for a long while. In the dimly lit chamber, Anne looked around the tapestried walls, the heavy bed, the quiet faces pretending indifference. All suddenly became eyes. The eyes of Cromwell, of Henry, of the court. By noon, the officials came again, asking questions that seemed harmless. Has your Majesty ever given a ribbon to Weston? Has your Majesty ever walked with Norris without company? Anne answered truthfully. She had nothing to conceal. But even as the words left her lips, she knew truth in the hands of her enemies was no longer truth. It would be twisted, torn from its setting, stitched into a garment of guilt to cloak her. As evening fell, Anne sat still in her chair, her hand covering her mouth, as if fearing that any sound escaping could be turned into a weapon. The ladies whispered, "Today she is strangely silent, only staring at us." And then, even that silence was reported, as new proof of her abnormality. When night descended, Anne knelt by her bed, whispering prayers. But within, she was not only praying to God, she was pleading with herself, "Hold the silence. Let no word become another chain." The 12th day ended, and Anne understood she was not only imprisoned by stone walls, but also trapped within the snare of her own words. Day 13, the 14th of May in the year 1536. On the 13th day, the London sky hung heavy and grey. The light that filtered through the small prison window seemed paler than usual, as if nature itself knew a sorrowful end was near. That morning, Anne no longer asked about Henry, nor did she mention the friends already taken. She simply sat still, her hands wrapped around her rosary, her lips moving softly in prayer. The ladies whispered among themselves, "She is strange today." No more arguments. No laughter. No tears. Within Anne, a truth was slowly taking shape. Death was drawing near. No more fleeting hopes dangled and then extinguished. No more empty promises of convent walls or mercy. She could already feel the icy edge of the sword waiting for her, though it had not yet touched her neck. At midday, Anne walked slowly through the chamber, her eyes drifting across each familiar object, the embroidered wall hangings, the wooden chair, the bed frame where she had once wept. Each item had become a witness, silently waiting to see her leave. She whispered, "Perhaps this is the last time I will see them." By evening, Anne called one of the ladies close, asking whether anyone had spoken of Elizabeth. The answer was a shake of the head. Anne nodded gently, without tears, her eyes closing softly. In her mind, the image of her daughter rose clear, fine golden hair, wide innocent eyes. She whispered, "Elizabeth, you will grow without remembering your mother's face, but I will always be with you." In this prayer, that night, Anne lay upon her bed, staring wide-eyed at the ceiling. The scratch of Kingston's quill echoed once more in the hall, noting the unusually quiet queen, yet there was nothing unusual in the truth. It was the calm of a woman who had begun to accept that tomorrow or the day after, the door would open, and she would never return. The 13th day closed, no longer torn between hope and despair. Only silence remained, the silence of one who had seen death waiting at the end of the corridor. Day 15, the 16th of May in the year 1536. The 15th day opened with chilling echoes outside the tower. Not music, nor prayer, but the sound of axes striking wood. It was the morning when the men condemned with Anne, Norris, Weston, Braytone, George Boleyn were led one by one to the scaffold. Each familiar name vanished beneath the blade, each familiar soul torn from the world. Anne was not there, but she heard the drums pounding beyond the walls, the murmur of the crowd, and the dreadful silence that followed each fall of the axe. And in her mind, she saw it all. Norris, Henry's closest companion, collapsing in the silence of the very king he had served. Weston, the young man who once joked at banquets, now nothing more than a head fallen into the dust. Brereton, a face faint in court records, now erased without trace. And at last, George, her brother, who had stood with her in every storm, cut down, branded with the vilest of accusations. Anne covered her face, sobbing. These were no longer the muffled cries of a queen, but the silent howl of a woman stripped of everything. She knew each stroke of the axe was also a blow upon her heart. The ladies recorded the scene, whispering that she was broken, out of control. But for Anne, it was not loss of control. It was the moment of clarity the path had closed. If these men, noble, loyal, even her own brother, had been slaughtered without hesitation, what chance remained for her, a lone woman? When night fell, Anne sat by the bed, her eyes raw with grief, her voice hoarse, whispering each name: George, Norris, Weston. Each name was a candle just extinguished, leaving her alone in the darkened chamber, with only the faint flame of one last candle, her own life. The 15th day ended in mournful silence, as Anne knew she would be the next. Day 16, the 17th of May in the year 1536. On the 16th day, the chamber within the Tower of London was wrapped in a dense, heavy silence. No more drums outside the walls. No more sound of the executioner's axe striking wood. Only emptiness remained. Anne sat on a chair, her fingers moving along the beads of her rosary. She no longer asked about Henry, no longer asked about Elizabeth, no longer spoke of the men who had fallen. All of it now felt like a blurred dream, and Anne, once the centre of a kingdom, was now only a shadow waiting for the final summons. That morning, news arrived that her execution would soon be set. A French swordsman had been summoned, a blade prepared, not the chopping block's axe, but a sword's swift edge, a final mercy. Anne went still, nodding faintly, her lips moving. At least, I will go quickly. Inside her, fear and calm intertwined. She feared the sword, the last instant when the world would vanish. But part of her felt a strange relief, for the endless waiting was finally about to close. As afternoon waned, Anne paced the narrow chamber. She practiced kneeling, lifting her head, whispering prayers. The ladies watched her, their eyes red, but not daring to come near. They knew she was preparing herself for her own last moment. When night fell, Anne sat by the small window, gazing at the Thames. The river flowed silently, reflecting the silver moonlight. She whispered, "Tomorrow, or the next day, when I am gone, this river will still flow, Only I will disappear. The 16th day ended in absolute stillness. As Anne, the woman who had once made England change its course, waited only for destiny's call to open the final door. Day 17, the 19th of May in the year 1536. The last day, the 19th of May in the year 1536. Before the sun rose high, the knock at the door echoed down the stone corridor. The chamber where Anne had lived opened, dim light spilling in. Erosion. She dressed in a dark grey gown with crimson sleeves, her familiar gable hood upon her head. Each movement was slow and composed, not the composure of indifference, but the composure of one who had endured 16 days of torment and was now ready for the final release. The ladies knelt, weeping, but Anne smiled gently. "Do not weep. I am going to God." She stepped out of the room, following the guards through narrow passages. The sound of her shoes striking the stone floor echoed steadily, like the drumbeat that leads a soul to the scaffold. In the courtyard of the Tower of London, a wooden platform had been raised. Upon it stood the French executioner, Jean Rambaud, waiting, not with an axe, but with a long, sharp sword chosen so that death might be swift. A mercy Henry granted, as though cruelty could be veiled in kindness. Anne stepped onto the platform. The crowd was silent, not the jeers of mockery, but a strange stillness, as though all present knew they were witnessing a moment beyond politics. Anne turned her face toward the people, her voice clear yet gentle. "Oh, all who are present here today, I come not to accuse anyone. I only pray for the king. May God bless him, for he has dealt kindly with me. May God protect the kingdom and grant blessings to you all." Her final words were not of accusation, but of forgiveness, a painful yet noble choice, to meet death not with hatred, but with the light of faith. Then unkneeled, one of her ladies stepped forward, removed her hood, and tucked her hair away. Anne placed her hands upon her chest and whispered softly, "Lord Jesus, receive my soul." The executioner stepped near, quietly calling to his assistant to distract her. In that instant, Anne turned her head by instinct, and the blade flashed in the air. One stroke, swift, clean, precise. Silence fell. No scream, no cry of pain, only the sound of the sword cutting the wind, followed by the faint drop of wax upon wood. Anne's body was hastily wrapped in coarse cloth, laid in a simple wooden coffin. No worthy tomb, only a hurried burial in the small chapel of St. 21, Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower grounds. And so, 17 days of psychological torment, 17 days of hope and despair interwoven, ended in a quiet morning. Yet that silence did not last forever, for from Anne's ashes, from the daughter scorned as illegitimate, Elizabeth would rise a glorious queen. To prove that Anne had not truly disappeared, the 17th day ended, but its echoes would resound forever. My dear friend, Anne Boleyn fell within the courtyard of the Tower of London. But the story does not end there. To understand why those 17 days unfolded as they did, we must look at the political chessboard behind them. Henry VIII, the king who once adored Anne so deeply, he defied the Pope himself, had grown weary. He longed for a male heir. But Anne had given him only a daughter, Elizabeth, and suffered repeated miscarriages. Each loss was not only a personal sorrow, but also a fracture in her power. Meanwhile, the court trembled under the weight of religious reform. Anne had supported Henry's break with Rome, becoming a symbol of the Reformation. Yet this very role made her a thorn in many eyes. Thomas Cromwell, the king's right hand, saw his opportunity. He needed the wealth of the monasteries to strengthen royal power, while Anne sought to use it for charity and education. This was not just disagreement, but a direct challenge. Cromwell understood if Anne remained, his own position would be endangered. And so, he did not kill with sword or dagger, but with strategy. He constructed a game in which every figure close to Anne was turned into a sacrificial piece, from the musician Mark Smeaton to her brother George Boleyn. All were bound together in a single indictment, so that Anne became not only a criminal, but the center of a whirlpool of disgrace. Henry, by then, was no longer the man who had once loved Anne with fevered passion. He now had Jane Seymour, gentle, quiet, soft-spoken, the complete opposite of Anne's sharpness and strength. In Jane, Henry saw the dream he had never attained a male heir, and thus, Anne's fate was decided not in her cell, nor upon the scaffold, but in the whispered councils behind closed doors. Cromwell needed her gone to preserve his power. Henry needed her gone to clear the path to Jane. And the court needed her gone to soothe unrest. Anne's death, therefore, was not simply the end of a woman. It was a political ritual, staged to legitimize her replacement. And with her death, Henry was free to marry Jane Seymour just 10 days later, as though history required only the briefest pause before turning the page. My dear friend, when we look at Anne's last 17 days, we see the darkness of a prison cell. But if we widen our gaze, we see a far greater chessboard, where every piece was being moved in a calculated political game. Henry VIII was not only a husband disappointed by the absence of a son, he was a king haunted by the fragility of the Tudor dynasty. His father, Henry VII, had seized the throne by blood, and ever since, this new dynasty had never truly been secure. A male heir was the only guarantee. Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, no matter how clever, no matter how beloved, could not provide the security Henry demanded. To him, Elizabeth was but a fragile bridge, incapable of supporting the weight of an entire kingdom. Meanwhile, the political forces within the court were not idle. Thomas Cromwell, master of design, understood that his power depended upon keeping the king content and the court stable. He saw that Anne was no longer an ally, but à danger. She meddled in governance, offered opinions on matters that, by tradition, women were forbidden to touch. She had enemies at court, men who despised her sharpness, her boldness, her refusal to be silent. Cromwell gathered all that resentment, shaping it into a weapon. He knew once Anne fell, Jane Seymour would step in. Jane was not sharp like Anne, not political, and therefore safer for all factions. For Cromwell, it was the chance to keep the board firmly within his grasp. Beyond the palace walls, the people no longer looked at Anne with admiration. When she first rose, they had called her the woman for whom the king defied the Pope. But in time, whispers turned to ridicule. Then to hatred, they called her a witch, blamed her for curses that unsettled England. Her miscarriages became, in the imagination of the common folk, proof of such a curse. Thus, when Cromwell raised his charges, no one came to defend her. She was utterly isolated, abandoned by the court, by the people, and even within the Tudor family itself. The silence surrounding her was no accident, but a quiet consensus. All saw her death as the key to greater stability, concentrated power, and the king's satisfaction. Yet the bitter irony is this: her death did not bring lasting peace. For as soon as Anne fell, Henry married Jane Seymour only 10 days later. And when Jane bore Edward, the long-awaited prince, she too died young, leaving behind a frail child. The Tudor dynasty still wavered, and the blood-stained injustice of Anne was never washed away from history. Thus we see, The death of Anne Boleyn was not merely the purge of a single woman. It was a mirror reflecting the true nature of Tudor, power fragile, hungry, and willing to sacrifice anyone to secure the throne. My dear friend, Anne Boleyn departed on that cold May morning of 1536. For Henry and the Tudor court, her death closed a noisy chapter and made space for Jane Seymour and the dream of a male heir. For Cromwell, it was a masterstroke of strategy. For the people, it was punishment for a woman who had defied the norms. But history never ends with a single morning. 10 years later, Cromwell himself fell beneath the very hand of power he once served. Henry, in his final years, sank into loneliness and disease, leaving behind a dynasty still unsteady. Jane Seymour lived only a short while after bearing Edward. And Edward, the longed-for prince, died young, passing the crown to his two sisters. Elizabeth, the daughter Anne never saw in her last 17 days, grew up in neglect, branded illegitimate, removed from succession. Yet, in 1558, Elizabeth ascended the throne, becoming one of the greatest queens in all history. Her 45 years of rule, the radiant golden age, proved that Anne's legacy was not buried in the small chapel of St. Plank. Peter ad vincula. Anne never knew she had triumphed. She walked to her death alone. But the seed she planted, Elizabeth, grew into a mighty tree. And through it, Anne became not only an executed queen, but a voice echoing across time. Tonight, as we retell her story, we do not only remember the last 17 days, those days of torture by silence, by rumor, by isolation, but also that from those ashes, a dynasty found its new light. Anne Boleyn lost her honor, her love, and her life, but she left behind a legacy greater than any crown, the lesson that history cannot be erased. And that silence sometimes echoes longer than the fall of the sword. And now, if you close your eyes, you may hear that whisper seeping through the stone cracks of the Tower of London, flowing with the Thames, and carrying across 5 centuries, the echo of Anne, still whispering in the night.